The bedrock floor a sound without source, yet everywhere at once, like distant desert wind moving through empty wells. The shadows here were not mere absence of light. They were cloaked things watching him, velvet and deep and still, in the center, resting. On a simple obsidian slab lay the object of the journey's endless AK tablet, not of clay or brittle shale, but solidified light, a square of flawless amber pulsed faintly with an inner gentle warmth. Keelan reached a hesitant hand toward the glow the moment his fingers neared the ancient surface. The humming intensified a chord deep within the earth. He saw within the polished depth of the amber, not writing, but shifting images, slow and profound visions of cities built on riverbanks, of mud ziggurats rising toward the indifferent stars, and the faces of people long turned to dust. Their eyes held the sorrow of perfect knowledge, the knowledge that comes just before the fall. The temptation was vast to simply cut to a fillet. The flood of history washed him clean, but a whisper cold and dry entered his mind. Not years to tick, not years to hold. He heard the words not with his ears, but in the slow, deep rhythm of his pulse. Chilling warning carried on the pressure of the air cross. The vastness of the pillared hall, where shadows pooled like heavy oil shape, began to solidify against the stone. It was a figure tall and impossibly thin-carved, seemingly from pure black basalt, but it moved slowly with the grace of sand shifting it. Held no weapon, only an empty hand, and its eyes were mere slits of polished darkness, sentinel older than the stone around it. The watcher did not speak with tongue or voice. It communicated through the pressure in the lungs. Silent, undeniable gravity. Balance must be kept. The cost is memory. If he touched the amber tablet, he would gain everything. The secret history, the names of the sun gods, the paths of the lost constellations, but he would lose the memory of who he was before, the velvet cloak of his own past identity dissolving into the weight of the ages. He sought a trade of self for certainty, a bargain with time killing. Felt the pull of the knowledge, the sheer hypnotic density of the light within the amber, a million years whispering take. Me knowest the basalt figure stood motionless, timeless, time guardian, carved from hushed resistance. Gale felt his own will falter, bending toward the ancient glow, but the image of his own small life, the scent of wood smoke, the sound of rain on glass, the simple smallness of a single human existence held him anchored to the present fragile moment. He stepped back one slow, careful pace. Amber light pulled him like the moon pulling the tide, but the cold wisdom of the sentinel held him fast. He chose. The path of doubt, the path of waiting to know too much too fast, was surely madness. The basalt figure did not pursue him. It simply stood its silhouette unchanging, but as Kalen turned toward the arched egress, the script etched upon the columns began to swirl. The ancient symbols detached themselves from the stone, drifting through the air like iron filings, lifted by an unseen magnetic pull. He walked through a curtain of swirling knowledge, a blizzard of forgotten language, each symbol passing close, whispering secrets sharp and fine. The king sleeps, the waters rise, the circle breaks. Kalen stumbled now, the ground unstable. Entrance archway shimmered, becoming indistinct. The edges of his vision softened, turning gray and hushed. He pushed through the curtain of drifting symbols out into the narrow tunnel he had used to enter, but the tunnel was different, longer, colder. Familiar scent of dry earth was gone, replaced by the metallic tang of deep cold water. He looked behind him, but the basalt chamber was gone. Only a sheer wall of gray polished stone remained, as smooth and featureless as frozen glass. The symbols that had chased him now pressed against the stone, melting into the surface, leaving faint trails of silver light, and then he felt the slight subtle tremor. The tunnel floor was sloping down, slowly descending, taking him further away from the known path into a darkness that swallowed sound and light. The cold metal smell intensified. He was no longer beneath the city, but perhaps beneath the sea, or beneath the memory of the city itself, a hollow space where the rivers ran backward, and the stone recalled the time of floods. He reached out his hand, feeling only the damp, smooth stone. The air grew heavy, thick with humidity, soft. Sound started far below him, the slow, rhythmic lapping of deep, unseen water. He was drifting now, his feet barely connecting with the smooth, cold rock. angle of descent steepened steadily. He felt a growing sense of profound disorientation. Was he moving? Or was the tunnel moving around him? The walls seemed to twist, slightly closing in the pressure mounted on his eardrums. He heard one last echo, faint and far away, the whisper of the stone chamber pursuing him. The circle was broken, closed his eyes, letting the slow, irresistible descent carry him further down into the hushed velvet abyss, the metallic tang of the air, a heavy flavor on his tongue. He had sought the ancient knowledge, and now the ancient earth claimed him, pulling him through its cold stone veins toward the sound of the rising tide, waiting for the water of the truth to rise. He drifted on the cold downward slope, lost. And the geometry of the deep ancient earth and the darkness held him a soft and endless fall. The cold breath of the world settled low. It clung to the breastplates. It gathered in the hollows of the ancient stone where they rested. Cold that knew no pity, no haste, just the deep, slow chill of the dawn before marching the embers of the night fire's breath to dying. Glow a pale whisper of smoke against the hushed dark thousands of cloaked forms lay scattered like fallen monuments, each man a bundle of aching muscle and desperate faith. The ground beneath them was hard, unforgiving earth, etched by countless forgotten wars. It offered no comfort, only the promise of more dust, more heat. This was the 8th month of the endless walk. The months had merged into a single weary, blurry continuum of sweat and thirst, and the dull rhythmic pain behind the eyes. The silence was heavy, a velvet cloak pulled tight around the camp, broken only by the low snorting of the horses, still tied, tethered, restless. And the dry cough that passed from man to man, a plague of the chest borne on the dust of the road, a man's start, just a shifting of weight. The grinding sound of chainmail settling against the stone. It was Baudouin, a knight from Flanders. His sleep had been thin, brittle, a net of tangled dreams about cold rain and green field streams. That dissolved instantly in the harsh reality of the Syrian plain. He did not open his eyes fully. He knew the color of the Pradon sky without seeing out a faint bruised indigo deepening toward the east. Felt the cold metal of his helmet resting beside his head, the ancient smell of cured leather and dried blood, pervasive, comforting in its familiarity. Was time not announced by trumpets, not called by command, but signaled by the internal clock of exhaustion and duty? The clock that measured life, not in hours, but in leagues traversed day. Slow wave of low sound began to ripple through the sleeping mass. The faint metallic whisper of men straightening tired limbs. The creak of wagon wheels being tested. Careful, slow packing of meager possessions. No one spoke loudly. The tone was hushed. Reverent, perhaps fearing to wake the land itself, a land that had swallowed the armies whole before them. Baudouin rose slowly, his joints protesting every degree of movement. His legs were pillars of exhaustion, the tendons tight as bowstrings. He reached for his sword, the familiar weight reassuring. The hilt cool in his palm, he looked toward the east, the great sun preparing its ascent. It would be amber soon, a burning, unbearable amber that bleached the color from the stones. He adjusted the heavy wool tunic, the layers beneath the mail, each layer soaked with the residue of weeks of marching, dust, salt, dried sweat. The air thickened with the scent of waking men and damp earth. The first rays of light caught the high edges of the low hills. Were brown, barren, monotonous, a landscape of eternal indifference. They spoke of deep antiquity of time, measured in geologic shifts. They made the lives of the Crusaders seem fleeting, insignificant, yet they were walking toward the light, always toward the distant mythic light of Jerusalem. The column began to form, a long serpent of tired men and beasts stretching back into the fading shadows. The standard bearers unfolded the banners. The sacred symbols, stiff and faded, they snapped lightly in the thin morning breeze, a dry, hollow sound, the sound of pilgrimage that had endured fire, flood, and betrayal. Rhythm of the march began, the slow, deliberate placing of the left foot, then the right. Sound that would become a drone, a constant hum throughout. The long day, the sound of thousands of soles striking the dry earth. The whisper of sand stirred by worn leather boots dust rose immediately. It was fine, powdery, inescapable. It coated the tongue, the teeth, the throat that filtered into the threads of the clothing, into the hinges of the armor. It became of the very breath they drew. A taste of the desert of the endless road. The pace was not fast and could not be fast. Every step was a negotiation between the will and the body's deep desire to simply stop to collapse into the dust and never rise. The horses stepped carefully, their hooves clopping softly on the stone paths, their heads bowed, carrying the weight of the supply packs, the sound of the harness leather rubbing against itself, a rhythmic creak, squeak, creak, 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 a mechanical meditation. The mind of the marcher drifted in this monotony. It was necessary for survival that the mind cease its demanding. It became hushed, detached, observing the body from a safe distance. The body walked. The feet moved, the sun climbed the sky, but the inner self rested, suspended in a sort of walking trance. Baudouin remembered the river. Not the river they had crossed yesterday, the sluggish, muddy stream, but the river of his childhood. The clean, rushing water of Flanders. He saw the thick, velvet green moss clinging to the river stones. He saw the reflections of the ancient oak trees in the glassy surface. A vision so clear, so perfectly detailed, it felt more real than the stone path. Under his feet, he tried to hold the memory, tried to drink that cold, clear water. But the heat was already pressing in. The amber light intensified, turning the eastern horizon into a furnace door. River memory fractured, evaporated, leaving only the burning thirst. They walked through terrain, scarred by ruins ancient. Cities long abandoned, their stone walls tumbled and bleached. Wind whistling mournfully through the empty window openings. These ruins were warnings, perhaps reminders of the empires that had sought eternity here and failed. The Crusaders did not speak of them. They simply walked past them, silent moving stones among silent standing stones. The sun reached its full power. It hammered down upon the steel helms, creating unbearable heat. Traps, the air shimmered above the baked earth, distorting the line of the march, making the men ahead seem to melt into the heat. Suit of armor became a portable oven. The sweat poured inside, soaking the protective padding. It ran down the ribs, stung the eyes, tasted like concentrated salt. Yet the march continued. There was no turning back. The distance covered was too immense, the sacrifices too numerous. They were closer to the ultimate destination than to the starting point, the destination. Define their present existence. The dust settled momentarily, then rose, stirred by the supply carts. It danced in the fierce amber sunlight, creating golden halos around the heads of the men. Brother Elias, walking beside Baudouin, adjusted his cowl. His face was drawn thin, almost skeletal, beneath the shadow of his hood. His eyes were fixed straight ahead on the road. Deep spiritual exhaustion mixed with physical depletion. Elias carried no weapon, only a staff and the heavy burden of prayer. He murmured ceaseless invocations, the sound a low dry rustle. Like papyrus rubbing together, the prayers were not requests for ease or rest. They were requests for strength to endure the next step, the next hour, the next mile. The path began a slow ascent toward a ridgeline. The effort required immediately tripled. The legs burned, the calves tightened, protesting the upward angle. Weight of the armor now pressed down, not just heavily, but critically. Each man bent slightly forward, leaning into the climb. The breathing became louder, sharper, a collective gasp of effort rising above the sound of the slow, treading feet. The sun seemed to hover directly above the ridge, waiting a slow, cruel test of devotion. The air was thinning on the height, the landscape unfolding. Beneath them was vast, empty, immense, mile upon mile of brown, broken earth, stretching to the hazy limits of sight. The scale of the journey became terrifyingly clear. The realization that they were a tiny thread of faith crossing an ocean of indifference. When they reached the crest, the momentary relief of stopping was profound. A pause of maybe 3 minutes, just enough time to gulp water ration, strictly warm, metallic tasting, to shift the straps on the shoulders, ease the pressure points, to look back and see the incredible winding length of their column. The 1,000 faces turned upward toward the pause, tired, desperate, hopeful faces etched with the lines of relentless hardship. Then the call came, a simple low horn blast, not sharp or demanding, just stating the obvious. Move on the downhill path was a different challenge. It required careful balance, fighting the momentum of the heavy load. The risk of twisting an ankle or stumbling on the loose stone was high. Baudouin focused his gaze on the small circle of earth immediately ahead of his boots, not on the distant horizon, not on a destination, just the immediate path, the small pebbles, the larger stones. The dried ruts left by previous rains, each footfall measured, deliberate, controlled. The rhythm Resumed the inevitable steady tramp, 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 the sound sinking into the subconscious. The mind, now fully immersed in the slow hypnotic pace of the long journey. They passed through a narrow defile, the walls of stone rising steeply on. Either side cloaking them briefly in shadow, the air was cooler, stale, dense. The echo of their own movement was magnified. 100,000 footfalls sounding like a muffled drumbeat. It felt ancient, this place, as if the stone itself remembered. The silence before their coming and waited patiently for their departure. The light reappeared, blinding intense as they exited the defile. The ground leveled out into a vast plain of hard clay. The walking resumed its steady, monotonous grind. The sun began its long, slow descent toward the western horizon. The amber shifted to gold, then to a deep, ruddy orange. Shadows lengthened, stretching out long, dark fingers across the plain. Air temperature finally began to drop a small, subtle mercy, but the fatigue was now absolute. It was the Bonadip weariness that no rest could truly touch only. The end of the journey could relieve this kind of exhaustion. Ancient cities, they sought the fulfillment of the vow that was the only cure they marched. Toward the promise of evening camp, the final goal of the day was not Jerusalem, not salvation, but the chance to lay down the armor, to drink water freely, to feel the blessed stone beneath the aching body. One more time, the cloaked outline of a village appeared on the horizon, small, poor, desolate, but it meant water and relative safety for the Nicaea. Hushed collective sigh seemed to pass through the columna, final surge of will drawn from the last reserves of strength. The last 100 paces were the hardest. The legs moved purely on autopilot, the sound of the final steps merging with the low light of the dying Daya. Testament to endurance, to the simple, brutal act of keeping going. The long, slow journey settling deep into the ancient earth. Of the waiting land tramp, slow and steady toward the rest would soon become another awakening. Another step closer to the holy city. Ochre dust rose slow and thick around their ankles, a fine, powdered memory of all the land they had crossed. Since the great river, the dry air catching the grains of earth, holding them suspended like flecks of pale gold in the relentless Syrian sunth march continued, relentless, unending, the silence deep, except for the squeak of dry leather in the low. Rhythmic breath of men accustomed to exhaustion, they moved like figures etched onto ancient stone shadows, dragging across the baking earth towards a holy city. Still months away in perception, but only weeks away by forced march. Heat was a constant. Presents a heavy woolen blanket pressed down upon their mail shirts, turning the steel into radiators of misriac. Man carried the weight of his resolve and the actual crushing burden of his kit, the cloak of fatigue wrapping around their hearts, making every sunrise feel like a cruel joke, and every sunset a brief fragile mercy. They had left the larger coastal cities behind the scars of great battles. Fading into the horizon, the political maneuverings giving way once more to the grim, pure necessity of walking endlessly over rock and shale. The landscape fractured into small, harsh fiefdoms ruled by petty emirs, who preferred quick gold to prolonged resistances. Commanders rode silently at the front, their faces drawn tight beneath their helms. Guy of Tarsus wiping the sweat that stung his eyes. Hugh of Saint Omer leaning heavily on the pommel of his saddle, every kilometer a punishment for old wounds. Horses stumbled, often their coats matted with salt, and thus their eyes rimmed red from the incessant glare. The water rations were thin, barely enough to wet the tongue, let alone satisfy the demanding thirst that clawed at their throats from dawn till dusk. They learned to suck small pebbles for the illusion of moisture, learned to ignore the gnawing emptiness in their bellies. The luxury of full supply trains, long forgotten remnants of distant Europethus, was the true pilgrimage of purification by fire and dust, a stripping away of the soft, pampered flesh until only bone and faith remained. The past ruined aqueducts, Roman remnants, monuments to civilizations that had also conquered and then vanished, leaving only their bleached stones. Behind these ruins stood sentinel over the slow march, reminders that even the strongest empires are eventually consumed by the earth and the slow, deliberate passage of time. Sky above was a pale, washed-out blue, infinite and pitiless, lacking the comforting clouds of the northern lands it offered. No shelter, only blinding light-toned morning after weeks of trudging through this ochre wasteland. A whisper began to ripple back through the long column. A sound not of complaint, but of a wee sight unseen for endless inland, less sea-topped. A low ridge, a sudden break in the rolling hills, and there it was the great. See the Mare Nostrum stretching out limitless. Sapphire blue against the blinding white horizon, it felt like a dream after the monochrome existence of the desert march. Sudden injection of deep, cool color into their weary souls. Contrast was startling, the hot, arid earth meeting the cool, velvet expanse of the ocean. A line of deep blue promismony dismounted, sinking onto their knees, not in prayer, but in sheer physical relief at the sight of that vast, endless body of water, though they knew they could not drink it. Its presence was a balm. Few knights, who had grown up near the coast, wept openly. The salt air carried faint and sharp a forgotten scent of home, of stability, of sanity. For hours the column moved parallel to the coast, close enough to feel the slight shift in the breeze. The air less heavy, less choking, but still separated by sharp precipices and guarded coastal tracks. Sea was a distraction. A beautiful, terrifying distraction, because it meant they were drawing closer to the density of Levant population. Ancient ports, the stronger walls, the true resistance of the Fatimid, and Seljuk garrisons. They knew the final push, the approach to the holy city itself, would involve navigating through small, fiercely held fortress towns like Tortosa and Tripoli, which clung like barnacles to the coastal rock Baldwin, a bullion road. Forward scanning the terrain, his visor raised, his gaze sharp and practical. The beauty of the sea did not blind him to the military realities. Present-head coastal roads meant easier potential ambush points, valleys meant restricted movement. They needed reliable intelligence and guides who knew the fractured political landscape of this coastline. Like the palm of their hands, they managed to secure a small amount of assistance from the local Christian enclave near the foothills of the high mountains, a Maronite community cloaked in the shadows of the ancient cedar groves. These people lived a precarious existence, caught between the warring factions of the coastal powers, and they offered what they could: small stores of dried figs, hard bread, and crucially clear water drawn from deep mountain springs. Water tasted like salvation, cold and metallic, sliding down their dry throats, reviving them slowly, painstakingly. Nights by the sea were quieter, the sound of the small waves washing against the distant shore a steady hush against the frantic beat of their journey. Air cooled rapidly, the temperature drop welcome, but also necessitating the extra blanket. The dew settling heavy on their bedrolls, chilling them to the bone. They slept soundly, wrapped in the knowledge that they were moving southward, relentlessly southward, always toward the goal. But the march was changing. Suddenly it was less about traversing vast open spaces and more about negotiation and siegecraft. On a minor scale, every few days they would encounter a small fortified village, perched precariously on a hillock or nestled defensively in a wadi, refusing passage. These encounters were tedious, not glorious battles. They were exercises in starvation and patience, the slow process of encircling a small stone structure, waiting for the inhabitants to yield, or attempt a desperate breakout. Logistics of these tiny sieges were frustrating. They bled resources and time, precious time that should have been spent marching Peter the Hermit, who had reappeared sporadically throughout the march since the great battle at Antioch, walked amongst the foot soldiers, offering whispered words of encouragement, his voice hoarse with the dust of months. Reminded them that every small stone wall they overcame, every minor skirmish they survived, was a necessary trial, a clearing of the path ordained by God. His presence, though sometimes irritating to the more pragmatic nobles, was essential to the morale of the common soldiers, who saw in him a living symbol of their initial vow. Constant psychological strain began to show in small ways. Amongst the knights, arguments flared over the division of dwindling captured resources, small treasures found in abandoned villages, ownership disputes over captured horses or better vantage points for camping. Godfrey of Bullion maintained a stoic discipline, his silence often more effective than shouted orders, his presence a steady anchor against the rising tide of internal strife. He knew the final weeks would test their unity more severely than any battle. They were no longer a unified massive army. They were a collection of fiercely independent baronies, each dreaming of the spoils of the Eventual conquest, each already planning their fiefdoms in the Holy Land. Memory of their shared suffering was the only glue holding them. Together they had to cross a stretch known locally as the Dog's Tooth Ridge, a formidable spine of mountains that jutted sharply into the sea, the path narrow, treacherous, demanding the column stretch out into a vulnerable single fooey. Engineers worked days ahead, smoothing the path, shoring up loose rock, clearing ancient landslides that had choked the mountain trek. It was slow, agonizing movement, horses slipping, men needing to use their hands to scramble over sharp edges. The sheer drop to the deep blue sea hundreds of feet below, a constant dizzying hazard wind whistled through the high passes. A mournful sound, a sound of ancient stone complaining against the incessant human intrusion up here. The air was thin and clean, the view breathtaking, but the difficulty amplified the vulnerability of the caravanti. Spent a week traversing this ridge, living on hard biscuit and the sight of the limitless ocean feeling. Terribly exposed small specks against the towering majesty of the world when they finally descended the last slopes into the relative shelter of a wide coastal plain. The collective sigh of relief was almost audible. A long hush sound of relief were now within the sphere of the city of Tripoli. A wealthy port city whose defenses were rumored to be impregnable, built of heavy sea stone and protected by layers of ancient fortifications. Crusader leaders held council in the amber light of a fading afternoon. The maps spread upon the cracked earth, weighted down by smooth river stones. Tripoli was too strong, too well supplied. They could not afford another prolonged siege like Antioch. The time was wrong, their resources too low, the goal too closet. They needed to bypass the major resistance, find the weaker links, the smaller towns that could be taken quickly to secure their flanks and provide a momentary boost of supplies. Debate was tense, voices low and sharp, muffled by the velvet cloth of the knightsome, argued for direct confrontation, asserting that leaving a major enemy city behind them was madness, a danger to their eventual retreat or supply. Leinsterers, pragmatic and weary, argued that the time for grand battles was over. Their objective was Jerusalem, not coastal conquest. They settled on the bypass, securing a treaty with the emir of Tripoli for safe passage in exchange for gold and promises of swift movement southward. A hollow piece bought with precious cointy moved quickly past the great walls of the city. The speed agonizingly slow to the men who longed for rest, but necessary to keep the nervous emir calm the sight of. The massive stone walls, the banners fluttering high above the ramparts, reminded them that the world they sought to conquer was not yielding easily. It was heavily defended, deeply entrenched. As they marched past the cultivated fields outside the city walls, the smell of irrigation water and ripe figs filled the air, a temporary sensual overload after the barren landscape they had endured. They saw the faces of the local populace, guarded, curious, peering down from the battlements, assessing this strange column of dusty, tired warriors from the far west. A brief moment of cultural exchange, a silent appraisal across the gulf of faith and motive as silence around the march became more profound, more weighted with anticipation. Every rumor, every piece of scattered intelligence about the geography ahead was devoured with feverish intensity. Knew they were entering the final administrative area. The immediate northern approaches to the holy city itself, names of the next small towns echoed in their whispered conversations. Jabal, Beirut, Sidon, all names that had held mythical status back in Europe. Now mere obstacles on a map. They chose the inland route where possible, avoiding the heaviest coastal defenses, opting for dry high ground away from the naval power of the port cities. This meant more relentless climbing, more dust, more heat, but better security. Landscape shifted, becoming rockier, scarred by old volcanism, sharp dark stones cutting their boots, requiring constant repair by the beleaguered camp cobblers. Sun seemed to bake the very darkness out of the stone, leaving the black rock shimmering with dry heave. Supply situation remained critical. Foraging was now the primary method of sustenance. They relied heavily on raiding small rural settlements unfortunate enough to lie along their path. A necessary cruelty that weighed heavily on the consciences of the more devout leaders. Raymond of Toulouse insisted on strict accountability for the excesses, ensuring that the focus remained on the holy mission, not on simple banditry, but the line was blurred daily by desperate hunger. Nights themselves had shed all superfluous gear, any object that did not serve the immediate purpose of survival or fighting had been discarded. Weeks agatha or chainmail was stained, their surcoats ragged, their faces tanned and weathered beyond recognition. They looked less like European nobles and more like hardened ancient mercenaries creatures. Forged by the unrelenting sun and the unending marsh, their prayer became more fervent, more desperate, often offered in hushed communal chants at dawn, the voices rough and low, blending into the sound of the morning wind. They prayed for water, they prayed for strength, they prayed for the swift end to the tedium of the journey and the final victory site of Lebanon's famous cedar forest. Deep in the higher valleys was a moment of ancient beauty. Trees stood like silent giants there, dark boughs offering thick welcome shade, the air beneath them cool, fragrant with resin. A moment of true respite. A cathedral built by Naturelli paused for a full day in the shadow of these ancient trees, letting the clean air fill their lungs. The silence of the forest, a profound counterpoint to the endless clanking of their journey, it was here that the leaders took stock of their remaining strength. The head count disheartening, but the resolve on Breakalethi were down to perhaps a third of the original fighting force that had crossed the Bosphorus, a small dedicated remnant driven by sheer focus. They were hardened, brittle, ready to break or to conquer. The path descended, leading them through olive groves and small terraced vineyards. Signs of settled civilization reappeared, hinting that they were moving into more productive, well-watered lands, closer to the heart of the Levant. But these lands were fiercely contested, every clump of trees, every rise of ground potentially hiding a contingent of local archers or skirmishers. She tightened their formation, the column moving closer together. The banners that had been furled to save were now unfurled, defiant symbols fluttering in the hot breeze. Color of the banners faded and torn was still rich crimson and deep blue, promising the violence and devotion they carried. They entered a region known for its high towers built long ago to guard against coastal raiders, tall stone structures cloaked in moss and shadow, watching their slow passage. They used these towers as reference points, markers of their progress, counting them down one by one, each past tower a step closer. Days melted one into the next, indistinguishable save for the shifting quality of the light and the severity of the heave. Monotony was a form of psychological weapon, a numbing repetition of movement. And dust that dulled the senses but strangely sharpened the wealthy ceased to think of the future or the past existing only in the immediate moment. The placement of the next footstep, the next ration of water, the next hour of relative safety. They crossed a broad ancient stone bridge spanning a surprisingly deep gorge, the masonry worn smooth by centuries of flood, and drowsed sound of their thousands of footsteps echoing hollowly beneath them, a sound like rolling thunder in the confined space. A momentary loudness in the otherwise hushed landscapes across the bridge. They knew they were past the last major geographical barrier before the final plain of Judah. Tension among the rank and file tightened palpably. Smiles were rare. Conversation quieter, focused solely on tactical necessities. Landscape began to shift, losing the coastal greenery, becoming drier, rockier, more severe. The true desert edges pushing it there turned fine and sandy, the wind whipping up small spirals of dust devils that danced maliciously across the cracked earth. He saw the first glimpses of the hills that promised Jerusalem itself, the distant hazy outlines of the Judean peaks. A geographical promise seen only through the heat shimmer. These were not the soft rolling hills of Europe. These were stark serrated edges, brown and sharp, unforgiving sight, though still distant, filled them with a renewed frenzied energy, the exhaustion suddenly masked by adrenaline. The deep inner furnace of their faith roaring back to life. They pushed harder, longer, forcing the pace, demanding more of the already weary animals. And their own aching bodies traveled late into the velvet night, guided only by the crescent moon and the low flickering lanterns. Held by the scouts, nights were cold enough to numb their fingers and chill the water in their leather flasks, a sharp reminder of the high elevation they were now traveling through land that had been fought over for millennia. Every stone held a story, every dried riverbed, the memory of ancient conflict be past the supposed site of the tomb of A minor prophet, a place of ancient reverence, and paused briefly in respectful silence, recognizing the layered history of this sacred land. Finality of their purpose was drawing near. The casual march was over. This was the relentless, committed. Advance of the leaders rode together now, more than ever, a tight knot of focused intent, planning the approach, the inevitable. Reconnaissance missions, the management of the immense logistical nightmare of besieging a major walled city with a force running on fumes and faith. Greatest danger was no longer the enemy, it was the fragility of their own system. The sheer weight of their collective exhaustion threatening to collapse the entire enterprise. Just meters from the finishing line, but the cross they wore etched into their shields and sewn onto their cloaks felt heavier now, more meaningful, a true representation of the burden they had carried yet. March continued, slow, punishing, inevitable, towards the hazy brown promise of Jerusalem, waiting, silent and cloaked in the distance beneath the indifferent sky. The cool air of the deep passage still clung to Thema. Silver chill, but now that chill was overlaid with something else, a humor resonance that vibrated not in the ears but deep in the bonia. Slow thrumming frequency of profound ancient power. They stood at the edge of the final Chambera space, hidden so deeply within the earth it seemed to predate the mountain above it. Doorway was not carved, it was fused a seamless obsidian archway blocker. Then the night sky, unlit by moon, cautious slightly, light of the small amber lantern was raised. The darkness yielded reluctantly, as if the chamber itself was conscious shielding its secrets. Close forward, permitting intrusion. The space was immense enough. Tall but wide and curved like the inside of a vast, perfectly smooth eggshell. But the true wonder was the ceiling. The ceiling was not stone. It was glass, or perhaps polished crystal, so perfectly clear and curved that it did not reflect the light it absorbed. Aen then gave it back in the form of stars, an entire celestial sphere etched and embedded into the overhead vault of the stars. They knew not the constellations visible from the world above, but the sky as it was millennia ago before the slow drift of the cosmic dust before the turning of the ages. The stars themselves were points of deep velvet light. Each point was a miniature sun held captive in the flawless darkness of the dome. Moved if you watched them long enough, a slow, majestic, lost, imperceptible rotation. The room was a clock-up planetarium, a chronicle of time written in silent fire. Air here was utterly dead now, just a stirred, no sound. It was a hermetic seal protecting us. Finally, irreplaceable view, they moved into the center of the chamber. The floor beneath their boots was smooth, cold basalt. They looked up, lost in the dizzying scope of the ancient knowledge. Who dealt this? Who possessed the science of patience, of deep cosmic understanding to map the heavens in perfect motionless motion. The scale of the civilization, one they had only pursued in fragments of stone and whispered myth, was suddenly vast, unfathomably. Felt a growing sense of hushed reverence. Was not a tomb of kings. This was the library of the stars. Monument built for the quiet contemplation of eternity. They lowered the lantern. The amber glow was too intrusive. The natural light of the star vault was enough, soft silver into long, gentle shadows. Raised dais stood at the center circular platform of paler stone, and resting upon it was the object they had sought, not a relic of worn, not a store of treasure, but a single scroll rolled and fixed in place. It was not papyrus. It was thin beaten copper oxidized to a soft jade green at the edges, but the main body was covered in symbols such with impossible precisions. Melt log ligged. They approached the copper sheet slowly. Cold radiating off the metal, the glyphs were different from those found outside the mountain. These were the language of the true ancients, the language of the stars. Tracing a finger across the cold, hard surface here, new hum began deeper than the first. The entire chamber seemed to inhale. The ceiling starch, which had been white and blue, began to shift color. First rate of slow. Arterial blush across the north quadrant and amber deepening and swelling across the western rim. The effect was magnificent. Turkey. Starlight was communicating. The copper scroll was an interfacia key. The shifting colors illuminated the glyphs on the scroll, highlighting certain sections while others faded into shadow. They realized the scroll was not simply text. It was a calculation, a trajectory, a prediction, or perhaps a warning. The highlighted glyphs focused on a single cluster of stars, a constellation They did not recognize it was positioned low on the horizon of the cosmic map, and beneath it were three specific symbols repeated, and the symbols translated themselves in the mind's eye not through practiced memory, but through the sudden psychic link. Established by the chamber's power, the symbols meant final rest, great shadow. Unmaking a profound silence returned, the colors faded back to their original silver luminescence. The copper scroll lay cold and quiet on the stone. The message was clear. Ancient civilization had foreseen their own end, had marked the location of their final sanctuary. Perhaps their ultimate failing in the cold, distant light of the ancient sky. The copper sheet contained the precise coordination within that. Complex astronomical calculations, pointing far beyond the desert, far beyond the known oceans. They stood, frozen, overwhelmed, not by danger, but by the sheer weight of historical sorrow. This civilization had possessed the means to leave a message in the stars, but not the means to survive their prophecy. They knew they could not stay. The chamber felt too exposed, now, as if, by understanding the secret, they had made themselves visible to whatever force the ancients had ferried. Carefully lifted the copper scroll. It was heavier than expectance, with forgotten knowledge rolling it, slow-lithe metallic edges whispering against the basalthy. Secured the scroll within the protective leather wrap they carried. The movement seemed to break. The silence, a sound not in the room but far away in the deep passages they had already traversed it, was a soft, inhuman, scrapious stone on stone movements was a cold, sharp needle, but the years of slow, patient pursuit had trained the response in a flight, but stillness listening. Scrape came closer, the sound of something large in it walking on two legs, but dragging itself across the rough-hewn floor of the outer tunnelway. Creaturia guardiana mechanism walking by the transfer of the scroll, the amber. Lantern was raised, its limited light pushing back the velvet darkness. They turned from the austere gaze sweeping the perfect black archway of the entrance. Nothing was visible, yet but the feeling of presence of immense cold weight was growing palpable. They moved swiftly, now not running but gliding toward the entrance. The hum in the air intensified. The chamber itself seemed to try to hold them back. Reaching the obsidian threshold, he glanced back one last time at the ceiling of the ancient sky. The captured stars looked down in cold indifference. They were observed knit saviors. The hum reached a peak, a silent scream of metal and stone. They slipped through the archway and into the narrow rock-cut corridor. The scent of stale dust and ozone hit them immediately, and the scraping sound was much closer, just around the first bend. They extinguished the lantern, a sudden plunge into absolute darkness. Darkness made thicker by the memory of the light. This was a tactical move relying on sound in the mooring not sight. They pressed against the cool, rough wall, heart beating a quick, steady drum against their ribs. Scraper drags, massive and unhurried, whatever. It was, it knew they were here. It was hunting by sound or by some deeper sense. The stone walls could not block. They moved backward, one step at a time, into the twisting labyrinth of the passage. Stone beneath their feet felt different now, slippery as if moisture had begun to weep from the rock face. They risked a whisper of light, a quick flash from the lantern. The passage was dripping with a thick, dark liquid. It smelled of iron and deep earth. The flashlight beam caught a glimpse of movement. It was larger to the ground, moving slowly around the corner. It was cloaked in thick shadow, but the light caught one detail, a single, iridescent and utterly without human recognition, a watchful guardian wrought of the very stone dust they walked upon. The lantern was killed. They pressed the copper scroll closer to their chest. The knowledge it held was already a Berdina mark. They turned and retreated fast with their boots padding quietly on the slick, wet stone. The passage twisted upward, a slow spiral ascent. A scraping sound followed, consistent, focused on the ascent, counting steps, counting twists. Air grew slightly warmer, a sign that they were gaining on the world above, but the fear was a constant, cold presence. They were carrying the heart of the ancient secret, and the mountain itself had sent its protector to reclaim it. The climb seemed endless. The passages were choked with fallen debris, slowly forcing their way through narrow gaps, a ways listening for the sound Of the pursuit, familiar whisper of air movement, fresh air, not the heavy, stagnant breath of the cool, clean breeze of the desert night. They reached the final exit point, small crack in the mountain, face hidden by a veil of wind-blown sand. They squeezed out, gasping for the vast open air. The desert stretched out under the cold, clean light of the distant moon. The sand dunes looked like frozen waves, vast, silent mountains of forgotten earth. They turned and laying small, smooth stones over. The exit crack working, quickly, silently, scraping sound stopped. They froze, listening hard. The mountain was silent. The guardian had reached the exit point and was waiting, a stone sentinel impassively. Guarding the return route, they moved away from the rock face, stumbling onto the soft, deep sand. They glanced down at the wrapped copper scroll, a heavy assurance of the unbelievable truth they now held, but the stars above, real stars, seemed to mock the ancient map they carried. They were ordinary now. The scroll spoke of a trajectory, a destination for a way under a sky that no longer existed. They walked away from the mountain until the endless night, the copper scroll cold beneath their fingers. The message was etched into their memory, final rest grate. Shadow, the making, where was this final resting place? Was it a timbre? Was it the key to surviving the unmaking? The desert air grew cold and they walked toward the unfamiliar constellations of the south, carrying the silent weight of a star map and knowledge of a forgotten prophecy moving into the deep, unknowing velvet of the nightward, the place where the shadows sleep, awaiting the dawn. Air was hushed, still holding the residual chill of the mountain. Night a breath held tight beneath. The pale skirt of dawn, the cold stone of the ridge, absorbed the first reluctant light, turning the eastern edge to a dull, dusty amber, slowly giving way to the promise of heat yet to come. They moved through the pre-dawn quiet, a column of shadows. Cloaked in thick wool and worn leather boots, scuffing the ancient earth, a dry rustling sound that became the only measure of time, the only heartbeat of the immense landscape. The horse's heavy breath fogged briefly in the thinning darkness, smelling of sweat and brine and the sharp metallic tang of old fear clinging to the edge of the memory. The rhythm was hypnotic, a slow, steady, unavoidable measure of feet on ground leather, on rock metal, clinking against metal straps, squeaking, softly protesting. The unending strain, step after step after step, the sound of thousands. Of men walking, not marching with vigor, but walking with the grim necessity of survival, a low pervasive drone that settled into the ears and became indistinguishable from silence itself. The path they followed was merely a suggestion of ancient movement, a track etched into the scree slope by centuries of shepherds and armies, and wind only now magnified by the weight of their pilgrimage. Man was a silhouette against the creeping light, his face obscured by the hood or the dust or the sheer fatigue that settled into the musculature like lead. They had been walking for months, and the concept of their origin had dissolved into the haze of memory, a fading dream replaced entirely by the immediate reality of the ankle, turned the thirsty throat, the burning sun that waited patiently above the horizon. The sun eventually offered itself a vast red disk, peeling itself away from the distant peaks, spilling that first true light across the valley floor, transforming the dull gray dust into shimmering gilded motes dancing in the cold air. The light caught the helmets, the dented shields, the hilts of swords, making momentary flashes of false glory, quickly swallowed by the general weariness of the host. They moved into a ravine, a dry wash, choked with thorny scrub and scattered boulders, the path dissolving and reforming with every few yards, forcing the men to watch their steps, to pick their way carefully. Danger was not battle now. The real enemy was the terrain, the vastness, the sheer, unending scope of the Anatolian expanse that seemed determined to swallow their effort, their faith, their very existence whole. The valley floor was flat and brutal, a plain that promised nothing but heat and distance, stretching out ahead until the world curved away into the unseen. The air grew heavier as the sun climbed. The promise of the cool morning evaporated, instantly replaced by the oppressive weight of the midday atmosphere. The dust rose in slow clouds behind them, stirred by the thousands of hooves and feet, a fine reddish powder that coated the tongue, the eyelashes, the inside of the nose, tasting perpetually of chalk and dryness. They wrapped claws around their faces, cloaking their mouths against the dryness, trying desperately to filter the air they breathed, but the dust found its way everywhere, into the seams of the armor, into the folds of the skin, into the soul of the movement. Only color was the tawny scrub, the relentless gray of the broken stone, and the blinding wittigold of the sun reflecting off the cracked earth. Silence of the middle distance was profound, a hushed reverence imposed by the heat, where even the insects seemed too lethargic to buzz loudly. The commanders rode silently at the head, their exhaustion perhaps deeper than the foot soldiers, for they carried the weight of the destination, the constant arithmetic of dwindling provisions and endless miles. Their armor was dull and scratched, bearing the scars of skirmishes fought months ago against Turkic patrols, remnants of fights now distant and strangely dreamlike. The reality was the walk, the unavoidable necessity of putting one foot in front of the other, repeating the action thousands upon thousands of times until the mind went blank and the body operated purely on instinct. The horses lowered their heads, their steps slow and deliberate, their tails twitching against the persistent presence of flies, creatures of the dust that followed the column like relentless tiny sentinels. Sometimes a man would cough, a dry racking sound that seemed impossibly loud in the otherwise velvet quiet of the plains. Sometimes a cartwheel would groan, a metallic shriek of protest that was quickly absorbed by the sound of the walking. The water skins were already warm, the meager supply managed with desperate care, only small measured sips allowed throughout the morning to merely wet the mouth, not truly quench the thirst. They passed the bleached skeletons of animals lost perhaps days or weeks ago, their bones picked clean by the vultures, and the sun-perfect white sculptures of mortality etched against the unforgiving rock. These silent markers served as a continuous reminder of the fragility of their journey, the ease with which life could simply stop. Absorbed back into the ancient dust from which it came, the sun reached its zenith, a merciless weight pressing down on the exposed necks and shoulders, forcing the men to slightly their focus entirely inward on the singular act of balancing and moving forward. Shadows shrank to tiny pools directly beneath their feet, offering no relief, no respite from the glare. The hours blended together, seamlessly marked only by the shifting position of the sun and the subtle deepening of the pain in the lower back or the ball of the foot. They did not speak of home. Now the memory was too sharp, too painful an indulgence. They could not afford. They spoke only of the next spring of water, the next patch of shade, the next moment when they might rest for even a short space of time. The very notion of rest was a velvet fantasy, a cool, dark cavern in the mind they could momentarily retreat to before the jarring reality of the next step pulled them back. The leaders occasionally looked at their primitive maps, stretched taut and brittle with overused tracing. The winding path, the endless detours, the mountains. They had yet to cross the fortifications. They had to skirt Jerusalem. Was a word, a magical whispered incantation, a beacon of faith that seemed at times too abstract, too impossibly far away to be real. It was easier to focus on the small things, the intricate pattern of cracks in the stone beneath the boot, the repetitive swinging motion of the arm, the faint smell of sheep carried on the distant breeze. The air tasted old, ancient, the dust containing the residue of countless generations, countless civilizations that had marched and built and fallen upon this same hard ground. They were merely the latest pilgrims in a long line of seekers, etched onto the skin of the earth, a temporary inscription of faith and movement. The afternoon deepened, the light shifting from blinding white to a softer, more golden hue, though the heat remained intense, a suffocating blanket that demanded continuous effort. The men walked in tight group, relying on the proximity of their fellows for comfort, a silent bond forged by shared hunger and shared pain. They knew each other's steps, each other's coughs, the particular way certain men shifted their weight when their packs became unbearable. This knowledge was unspoken, a deep elemental understanding that required no words, only the shared rhythm of the slow, inexorable march. A slight rise appeared ahead, a long, gentle incline that promised perhaps a view, a change of scenery, a psychological lift before the next flat expanse. The column reacted instinctively, leaning into the effort, their pace slowing almost imperceptibly as they began the subtle climb. The sound of their breathing became marginally louder, the leather protesting a little more vigorously. Against the strain, reaching the crest was a minor victory. A small triumph over the tedious horizontal world from the top they could see for miles. A sweeping panorama of dusty ochre and distant purple mountains, a landscape vast and indifferent. And there, far, far in the distance, a small hint of green, a dark stripe suggesting the presence of a river or a significant town that might offer true respite. The sight drew a collective hushed intake of breath, a momentary halt in the ceaseless rhythm of the march, a flicker of renewed purpose in the thousand tired eyes. Distance was immense, still too great for immediate joy, but the change in the visual horizon offered sustenance better than any bread. It was a sign that the land was not entirely dead, that life persisted even in this brutal Middle Earth. The commanders pointed their hands, sketching the route across the air, describing the final agonizing of this leg of the journey, the crossing of the last stretch of true wilderness before reaching the settled lands closer to the coast. The river, the Green Line, was still perhaps 2 days' march away. 2 more full cycles of the sun, 2 more endless stretches of dust and stone, but it existed, and that was enough to pull the weary legs back into motion, to restart the hypnotic drone of the feet. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery shades of amber and rose, transforming the harsh edges of the mountains into soft velvet folds. The shadows lengthened, stretching long and thin across the plain, following the moving column like reluctant ghosts. The air slowly began to cool, a blessed relief that brought with it the evening dampness and the increased threat of cold. Once the sun fully disappeared, they would camp, shortly seeking what meager shelter the ravines offered, settling down amongst the familiar smell of wood smoke and tired bodies. The thought of stopping was the only thing that mattered at the moment, when they could drop their burdens and sink down onto the cold earth. But until that moment they walked, they continued their slow, steady, unwavering progress toward the distant goal, a flow of iron and flesh etched forever onto the historical journey, a relentless pilgrimage of faith and endurance that knew no punctuation, only the long, continuous sentence of the road. The final miles of the day were the hardest, the exhaustion absolute, demanding sheer will to maintain the pace, the body aching in places that defied description. The sky deepened to a heavy bruised purple, the first tiny distant stars beginning to pierce the thinning atmosphere. The column became even quieter, the men conserving their remaining energy for the final push into the chosen resting place. The sound of the walking changed, subtly becoming softer, more dragging, a whispering sound of desperate effort carried on the gathering evening breeze. The path turned abruptly, following an ancient, dry riverbed offering walls of stone for protection against the night winds. Signal came finally, a low horn blast, echoing softly against the rock, a sound of release, promise fulfilled. The men stopped, slowly collapsing onto the ground rather than merely sitting, the relief palpable, a physical shock to the system. The noise of the halted army was immense, a sudden cacophony of coughing sighs, packs hitting the ground, the metallic ring of dropped equipment. A final brief explosion of sound before the hushed settling of the campfires, where quickly started small sputtering flames that fought against the damp air, throwing warm amber light onto the tired faces. The scent of dry wood smoke mingled with the smell of damp earth and unwashed cloth, a smell of exhaustion and momentary peace. The stars now spread above them, an impossibly vast velvet canvas reminding them of the true scale of the world and their small place within the ancient journey. They ate their meager rations, chewing slowly, thoughtfully conserving the energy. Jake was low murmured, barely audible questions about tomorrow, about the river, about the miles yet to be faced. The simple act of lying down was a profound luxury, a surrender to the gravitational pull of the earth. After months of resisting its sleep, approached like a quiet hunter, stealing the consciousness one exhausted thought at a time. The sounds of the camp faded into the background, the gentle snorts of the horses, the occasional clink of a guard inspecting his weapon, the low drone of prayer muttered into the cold night air. The stone earth beneath them was hard, cold, yet comforting in its stillness, a foundation of ancient strength supporting their weary forms. They rested knowing the dawn would bring the heap of dust, the unending rhythm of the walk once more. But for this hushed moment, the journey ceased. The world became velvet, quiet, a deep, deep silence holding them safe until the amber light returned. The dreams that came were silent dreams of coolness and water and fields of green, forgotten by the long. March a gentle slipping away into the deep, dark promise of temporary oblivion, where the step and the stone did not exist. The march continued southward into the unforgiving light. The sun above the Levant was not the generous sun of Europe, it was a hammer striking the helmet, striking the exposed skin, striking the thin supply of water carried and stretched. Leather skins, the weight of the 3 years' walk, settled into the bones. The sheer accumulated gravity of every mile since Constantinople, since Nicaea, since the crossing of the mountains, since the terrible dust of Antioch. This stretch of road was narrower etched into the coastal stone, where the green strip of fertility rapidly surrendered to the arid scrub. The air was heavy hot, and thick not wet heat, but a dry suffocating mantle that bleached the color. From everything except the deepest shadows and the relentless blue of the sky, the dust was fine, ancient dust, pulverized. Remains of forgotten kingdoms clinging to sweat, plastering the faces of the foot soldiers, cloaking the slow procession in a uniform shroud of beige and gray. They had passed the cities of the Phoenician coast tied in Beirut. Great monuments of stone, they had seen them as distant shapes refusing to be drawn to unnecessary sieges. Jerusalem was the goal. Jerusalem, the prize, the culmination of every vow, every hardship. Yeah, the proximity of the goal was a new form of torment. It felt impossibly close on the maps drawn crudely on parchment yet. The miles stretched out like an endless tether, never seeming to slacken. The heavy men clad in mail moved slowly, deliberately, their gaits reduced to a shuffling. Hypnotism, they moved always toward the south, their shields catching the cruel midday. Glare their worn boots, kicking up the choking powder. Knights rode with heads bowed not in deference, but in sheer exhaustion, the metal of their saddles burning through the cloth, the leather, creaking a monotonous protest against the forward. Motion, every sound was amplified in the oppressive stillness, the clinking of mail, the soft rasp of breath, the dry coughs, the low guttural complaints, exchanged between men who knew they could not stop. They sought water with the desperation of dying. Meant the streams they found were often meager, choked with silt, or worse, tainted by the passage of previous companies, or by the refuse of conflict. The water tasted metallic thin, unsatisfying, only serving to temporarily soothe the searing thirst before. The heat claimed the moisture once more. They began to climb. The flat coastal plain gave way to rolling hills. Then steep, sudden ascents, the ground turning from soft earth to unforgiving stone. These were the Judean foothills, the rugged, broken land that protected the holy city. The geology itself was an enemy, sharp rocks, twisting ankles, punishing the hooves of the few remaining horses, forcing the men to brace against the incline, their muscles burning with effort. They saw the deep fissures, the dry wadis, the valleys where shadows clung even at noon, places where an ambush could be sprung from absolute stillness. Fear was hushed, it was constant, a low thrumming vibration beneath the surface of the exhaustion. The local populations they encountered were universally hostile or utterly vanished, leaving only ghost villages of stone baked white under the sun. No easy supplies were found, no willing merchants, no gentle welcome. The army was forced to subsist on the hard, dry biscuits stored months ago, on what meager grain they could forage, and on the hope that food would simply appear when the final destination was reached. Hope was a difficult ration, thin and easily spent. The nights offered a temporary reprieve as the sun sank below the western horizon, casting long amber shadows across the rocky terrain. A sudden coolness would descend. The air would clear, the dust would settle, and the velvet dark of the desert night would embrace the weary thousands. The setting of the camp was a ritual of profound slowness. No unnecessary energy was expended. Men dropped their shields, their burdens, their bodies onto the parched ground, too tired, often even to scrape out a decent fire pit. The fires that were lit were small, hesitant things, tiny flickering pools of amber light against the vast blackness. Warmth was welcome, but the primary desire was rest. Silence, the suspension of movement. Sentries walked their posts slowly, their shadows long and distorted against the hills, their minds struggling against the creeping lethargy of sleep. Stars above were brilliant, merciless diamonds scattered across the deepest black vault, a sight that reminded them both of the terrifying scope of creation and the terrifying distance from home sleep for the common soldier was usually profound, instant, and dreamless, a brief obliteration of the day's suffering, but for the leaders, the counts, the dukes, the weight of command meant restless turning. They lay within the hushed confines of their temporary tents, discussing maps, plans, the strategy for the coming siege, how many men remained, how much water could be stored, where would the walls prove weakest, the logistics of besieging. A major stronghold nestled high in the hills, after 3 years of continuous movement, were daunting. Even terrifying bowmen perhaps slept better than the others. His mind sharp focused on practicalities, but Raymond of Toulouse and Godfrey of Bouillon carried the weight of the sacred vow, the pressure of 1,000,000 prayers resting upon their shoulders. They were so close, the fulfillment of their oath was within sight, yet the hardest labor lay ahead. The sun rose violently, ending the peace of the night. The chill evaporated, instantly replaced by the rising furnace heat. The process of packing up the gear, of replacing the mail, of slinging the shields, began in the gray light before dawn. The feet, the shoulders, the backs that had rested briefly were immediately reminded of their chronic aching condition. The water ration for the morning was tasted, measured, quickly swallowed. A brief illusion of refreshment, and then the forward motion recommenced. Day after grinding day, they pressed on southward, the landscape changing subtly but persistently. They were leaving the coastal civilization, entirely entering the ancient world of the hills of prophets and hermits. The stone they walked upon was older, rougher, etched with the signs of massive geological shifts. Sometimes they passed great monolithic ruins, silent witnesses to centuries of conflict, places cloaked in deep shadow and deeper history. These ancient stones felt heavy, charged with memory and purpose. The air grew thinner, somehow drier, sucking the moisture out of the lungs. The smell of the march was inescapable, a complex odor of unwashed wool, stale sweat, dusty leather, and the faint but constant scent of metal worn thin by friction and weather. The smell of the horses was strong too. Those that survived were skeletal, high-strung beasts suffering intensely under the load of armor and rider. Many horses had died in the rough passage of forcing knights to walk beside their remaining squires, and added indignity. Exhaustion, the fatigue became a character in the army, a silent companion walking beside every man, whispering insidious doubts into the ear. Why were they doing this? How many miles were left? They even survived to see the walls. The sheer relentless monotony of the movement was designed to break the mind. Left foot, right foot, dust, heat, stone, water, thirst, repeat. There was no distraction save the occasional distant glimpse of a fortress tower or a sudden surge of worry as scout parties returned. With tales of skirmishes, the closer they came, the more aggressive the defenders became. Small skirmishes erupted daily along the flanks and the leading edges of the column. These fights, though minor, drained precious energy and forced the weary men to raise their shields, to draw their blades in the full heat of the sun. The sight of blood was a shock, a visceral reminder that this was not merely a pilgrimage, but a war of attrition where every drop of sweat, every particle of dust was paid for. Dearly they entered a region known for its olives and vines, but the fields were mostly scorched, abandoned, or stripped bare. Concept of foraging had long ceased to be rewarding. They were reduced to walking through desolate, beautiful, but utterly exhausted land. The silence of the afternoon march was often broken only by the rhythmic squeak of a poorly maintained wagon wheel or the constant metallic ringing of mail shifting against itself. The sun climbed to its zenith. The shadows contracted to sharp black lines directly beneath objects, offering no relief. Men walked head down, eyes fixed 6 inches in front of their boots, simply placing one foot where the last one had been. They saw mirages shimmer on the distant horizon, illusions of lakes of shade, of cool, welcoming forests that dissolved upon approach, leaving only the relentless, baked earth. The psychological pressure mounted. They were not just fighting the heat and the distance, they were fighting the accumulated memory. Every casualty, every starvation, every freezing night spent waiting for dawn. The past was a lead weight strapped to their backs, and yet the discipline held the core belief, the absolute conviction that Jerusalem represented the center of the world. The fulfillment of their holy quest kept the column moving inch by agonizing inch. The priests walked amongst the ranks, offering encouragement, singing low chants that rose and fell with the slow rhythm of the march. Their voices were hoarse, cracked by the dry air, but the words offered comfort, the reassurance of divine mandate. They spoke of the final glory, the cleansing, the salvation that awaited them when they finally knelt upon the sacred stones. This promise of a final transcendent moment of rest and victory was the fuel that sustained the final steps. They passed through a narrow defile, a gorge where the wind whistled a thin, mournful sound through the towering limestone cliffs. The passage took hours, the sun high overhead, beating down into the trough of the gorge. When they emerged, the landscape opened up, slightly revealing a higher plateau, and from this rise the air felt different, taut with anticipation. The officers rode forward, scanning the distant horizon, the haze of heat blurring the shapes of the far hills. They knew they were close to the final ridgeline, the last great barrier before the city. Men could feel it too, the collective change in tension, the subtle increase in pace driven not by command but by sheer desperate hope. They were walking into the historical weight of the world, the place where all the threads of their faith began. The ground beneath them was becoming rockier, more sparse, less forgiving. No trees offered shade here, only short, tough scrub, clinging stubbornly to the dust and stone. The hours of the afternoon dragged on mercilessly, the shadows lengthening only infinitesimally. Light changed, becoming harsher, yellower, illuminating every scar, every mark of wear on their equipment and their bodies. The evening descended rapidly, as it always did in the arid regions. The halt that night was met with an audible sigh of relief from thousands of throats. Fires were scarce that evening, the men too tired to gather wood, too conscious of the need to conserve energy for the coming dawn. They huddled together, seeking warmth as the temperature plummeted quickly after sunset. The stars returned, blazing down upon the silent camp, a hushed velvet curtain drawing across the end of another terrible day. But tonight's sleep was more difficult for many. Anticipation was too sharp, too close to the surface of consciousness. They lay awake, listening to the sounds of the night, the distant howl of an unseen predator, the rustle of dry weeds, the soft rhythmic breathing of their comrades. They thought of home. They thought of the terrible journey they had made, and they thought with blinding intensity of the stone walls they knew lay just beyond the next rise tomorrow. The scouts promised tomorrow or the day after they would see the final objective. The city waited, patient, ancient stone etched with 1,000 years of desire and conflict. They knew that the final test would be the hardest, the most brutal. They would face strong walls, fresh defenders in a terrible thirst, but they had walked thousands of miles. They had survived plague, starvation, and battle. They had reached the edge of their world, the conclusion of their vow. The only direction left was forward into the light of the morning, toward the silhouette of the final hills, cloaking the holy city. The air was cold here, not the sharp, bitter cold of mountains, but a deep, hushed cold that seemed to come from the heart of the earth itself. It was a cold that carried the scent of dry mineral and undisturbed shadow. Stone floor beneath the explorer's boot was impossibly smooth, polished by centuries of silent waiting, a velvet sheen reflecting the low amber glow of the lantern. We stand now in the antechamber, room carved, not built, a space that feels less like architecture and more like the inside of a massive sleeping shell. The entrance we slipped through had sealed itself without sound, a soft click of ancient machinery returning to its slumber, leaving you was entirely cloaked in the deep resonance of this forgotten place. The ceiling here was low, yet the room felt vast. Silence, swallowing the tiny sounds of breathing and shifting.